Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. So my name is Perrine Fournier. I work as a campaigner with Fern. Maybe before we start with the introduction, we would like to let you know that this event will be recorded. You can click the language button on the globe at the bottom of your screen and select Bahasa for interpretation. And after the presentation, there will be a Q&A session. So if you want to submit any questions or remarks, please use the Q&A function and the speakers will answer your questions. It's really great to see you, such a diverse group in the room. So I will briefly introduce the scene and explain why we are having this webinar today. So you know that last September 2025, the EU and Indonesia signed a comprehensive economic partnership agreement called CEPA and an investment protection agreement called IPA. And they concluded 9 years of negotiations. Indonesia holds the world's third largest tropical rainforest, covering over 50% of its land. It's vital for global biodiversity and carbon storage. However, in 2025, forest loss increased by 66%, driven mainly by palm oil, mining, and infrastructure, and reversing years of decline. And yet, this trade deal with the EU foresee increased trade in forest risk commodities such as palm oil, which is a strategic commodity in EU-Indonesia trade relationships, and accounting for 1/4 of the trade flows between Europe and Indonesia, according to the Commission. To analyze this trade deal's impact on Indonesian forests and peoples, we have two honorable guests with us today. James Harrison, co-director of the Center for Human Rights in Practice, School of Law in the University of Warwick, and Axel Marx, deputy director of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. Axel Marx and James Harrison have conducted an analysis that identified the innovation, risks, and mitigation measures needed to ensure the CEPA and IPA don't harm Indonesian forests and people. You can find the analysis on our website, as well as a briefing summarizing the main findings and the recommendations. So James and Axel will present the risks and opportunities for forests and peoples in the deal, and we'll share some ways forward to engage with the process. And after the presentation, we will have a Q&A session. So now, without further delays, I will pass the floor to Axel and James.
Thanks, Perrine. I think I'm going to start. Thanks very much for inviting us to get involved in this analysis and to present today. And we're really going to look at the key risks and opportunities created by the agreement. So I'm going to start by just talking through some of the kind of key overall risks and opportunities that we found in our report. And then Axel's going to dive into talking about palm oil specifically, and some of the kind of key engagement mechanisms that the agreement includes. So we're looking at the 2025 text of the agreement as agreed between Indonesia and EU negotiators before kind of legal revision. So those texts are available. You can find them on the Commission website. CEPA has 25 chapters, and we are concentrating on these here. I'm not going to read them all out, but you can see them. And the reason we concentrated on those was we analysed the agreement as a whole, and we identified these chapters as being the ones that created the really significant risks and opportunities for forests in terms of the kind of forest risk commodities that Perrine was talking about. So commodities like palm oil, but also in the processes like the mining sector, where there were risks created as a result of potential commitments in the agreement. So the report that Perrine mentioned is a very detailed report which goes through those chapters in a lot of detail. I think we can put the link to those reports in the chat so people can have a look at that if they want to. Today, we're just going to look at an overview of some of the real key risks and opportunities created by the agreement. And so I'm going to start off by doing that now. So, yeah. So first of all, focusing on risks posed to forest protection by CEPA and the IPA. First real risk is around the market access provisions and associated tariff schedule annexes, which are found in chapter 2, that chapter on market access and national treatment for goods. So here what we find is commitments to reduce custom duties and to not use export bans and export duties. And it'll depend on the commodity, and the tariff schedule is massively complex, but all of generally is 98% of all of those commodities that the duties are eliminated. And so we need to have a look through each of those commodities, pulp, paper, nickel, cobalt, to find out the precise duties. But if we take palm oil as an example, the MFN, so the base rate without the trade agreement, is between 3.8 and 12.8% tax on palm oil. And so the agreement wipes that out. What it then does is introduces quotas. So up to a certain quota, you then get duty-free access. But those quotas are really significant. So what we're looking at for cumulatively for palm oil products is around 2 million metric tons allowed of importation, rising after 9 years to around 2.7 million metric tons. So a very significant amount of imports. So this obviously creates this increased importation also creates risks of increased production, which creates risks for forests. Now, there's a complex causal chain there, which I don't want to go into in detail, but the report sets out in a bit more detail. But obviously, there is a risk that we will have increased production of palm oil, and that creates the risks for forests. Then I'm talking about, we put up there on the slide, the liberalization of investment restrictions in mining and agriculture and a schedule of concessions annex. So here, what the agreement does is create a kind of what you might think of as a sort of stable environment for EU investors to come into Indonesia and set up companies in mining and agriculture that will then produce forest risk commodities. And again, the schedule of concessions is really complex, but basically what it does is create obligations to stop the Indonesian government putting additional regulations that might affect those industries in various different ways, and so creates a more stable environment for those investors in the future. And we would assume that it would increase investment and increase EU involvement in those industries, again, creating some significant risk of increased production. So then moving on to the investor protection provisions, I'm going to say a bit more about that in a bit more detail in a moment, but those investment protection provisions, again, can create risks that the Indonesian government might be sued on behalf of EU companies in industries like the mining sector. And so that creates risks that I'll talk about a little bit more detail in a moment. And then finally, there are commitments that restrict Indonesian policy space on raw materials. And we picked out a couple there that are particularly important. So a ban on dual pricing of exports, an obligation to remove any taxes specifically applied to exports, and a prohibition on export ban. So these are provisions collectively that create restrictions on the Indonesian government's policy space to incentivize domestic processing of raw materials, to create kind of added value products. So we might think of that's important in terms of development for Indonesia. It also obviously increases the free flow of these raw materials between Indonesia and the EU. Okay, so then moving on to the overall opportunities. to enhance sustainable production and the protection of forests and to empower civil society. So there are much more detailed sustainability commitments contained in the Palm Oil Protocol that Axel's going to talk through in a moment. I'm just going to mention some of the others that are a lot less detailed, but there are a series of provisions that kind of create the potential for a framework for cooperation between Indonesia and the EU in other areas. So on other agricultural products beyond palm oil, I would say the provisions are a lot less detailed, but there is a chapter on sustainable food systems. And this creates a framework for the EU and Indonesia to cooperate on policies and programs that lead to sustainable food systems, including, I suppose, most relevant in our context, to minimize the possibility of environmental and climate impact of food production. And so you can see how that kind of form of cooperation might lead to action to address kind of the climate impacts of forestry commodities. And so there's a duty to create an annual action plan there in relation to those kind of issues. As Axel will go on and talk about later, a lot then depends on how that is implemented in practice. And there are various engagement mechanisms through which that might work. But Axel will go on and talk about those and some of the limitations of those as well. Similarly, then, when we come on to forest timber protection measures, there is again a set of activities that you might cooperate on. Mostly these are kind of knowledge exchange and cooperation. Probably the most significant there from our perspective is to look at the effective implementation and monitoring of the EU-Indonesia Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade Voluntary Partnership Agreement, the FLEGT agreement, which cooperating to make sure that that is effectively implemented. That's something that can occur through the agreement as well. And then on raw materials, there are cooperation provisions in Chapter 14, and then particularly cooperation on energy and raw materials, information sharing, joint research, and promoting international environmental standards for mining. And then in Chapter 15.7, those are the ones on raw materials, which could potentially lead to increased environmental standards in the mining industry. So there are a lot more cooperation provisions. Those I've just picked out those that are most relevant within those three chapters. As I said, with regard to all of those obligations, it's how they're implemented in practice that matters, and Axel will go on to talk about the kind of mechanisms of engagement through which those cooperation provisions might be implemented. Finally, there is so one of the most trumpeted parts of the agreement in a way is the new binding obligations that have been included with regard to both labour rights and environmental provisions through the Sustainable Development chapter that is now enforced through the Dispute Settlement chapter 22 of the agreement, and that's a significant change from previous EU agreements where there wasn't that kind of ability to use the binding dispute settlement provisions of the agreement. However, actually, it's quite limited when it comes to the kind of environmental obligations contained within CEPA. So there's actually only one commitment where the binding dispute settlement process can be utilized, and then trade remedies can be used to enforce that. So that makes it significant because it means the parties can take action to enforce the obligations once dispute settlement has happened. And that is the obligation under 15.73 that each party shall remain in good faith a party to the Paris Agreement. So that's an essential element of the trade agreement, but in a way it would take a really fundamental breach by either Indonesia or the EU to not be a party in good faith to the Paris Agreement. And so whether that provision will actually be utilized in practice, I think, is potentially questionable. then just moving on, I want to say a few, before I hand over to Axel, just a few words about the EU-Indonesia Investment Protection Agreement. So what this agreement does is provides various protections for European investments in Indonesia and vice versa. So for those of you familiar with investment protection agreements, this contains a number of substantive obligations that you'll have seen before in other investment agreements. So a national treatment provision that requires we'll concentrate on Indonesia, the Indonesian government to provide similar treatment to both domestic and EU investors. A fair and equitable treatment provision that requires the Indonesian government to treat EU investors fairly and equitably. A requirement that the Indonesian government doesn't take investments from EU investors or undertake action that is equivalent to kind of taking those investments. And these are provisions that have all been in a lot of previous investment agreements before. In this investment protection agreement, they're balanced by a series of provisions that give the governments the right to regulate, for instance, for the purposes of sustainable development. So these provisions are not as extensive as we find in other investment agreements. And probably most importantly, in terms of limiting the effect of this agreement, it's currently only allows state-to-state dispute settlement. So it would require a case to be taken by the EU against Indonesia for the obligations in this agreement to be enforced. Some of the cases previously that have been taken that have been more of a concern and a worry for those concerned about protection of forests have been taken by investors, and so there tend to be more cases when investors have the right to bring disputes than when it's just states. So currently, this only allows state-to-state dispute settlement, but the EU and Indonesia are aiming to conclude an investor-state dispute settlement system within 3 years. So I think it's important to kind of watch that space and see whether that agreement is concluded. So, Indonesia has faced a number of investment mining cases, but in particular over recent years around, for instance, domestic ownership of mining, export restrictions on unprocessed minerals, and domestic processing requirements. And so there's obviously a risk there that particularly if that ISDS process, that investor-state dispute settlement process, is agreed, that more of those cases might be brought in the future. Albeit, as I say, there are more caveats and protections for the government's right to regulate than there have been in previous agreements. So I think I will stop there then, and I've sort of gone over some of those overall risks and opportunities, and then leave Axel to dive in more deeply to the palm oil protocol and the mechanisms of engagement within the trade agreement.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much, and thank you to Perrine and Fern for inviting us to present the report we did. As James said, I will delve a little bit deeper into the new protocol, which is included in the agreement on palm oil, and try to highlight some of, let's say, the main features, maybe some also of the weaknesses or issues we can identify, and we can also feed that into the discussion. And actually, one of the things, I think, one of the bottom lines I will try to convey is that this protocol is, I think, an interesting new innovation to deepen some of the sustainability commitments which are linked to trade agreements. And there are some interesting elements in there, but a lot will depend on implementation and next steps in the operationalization of these commitments. And from that perspective, I think also what will be in the part on institutional mechanisms to further engage is very important to look at. And I will try to end my brief presentation with focusing on that. But maybe first, let's start with a bit of an introduction into this new protocol, which is commodity specific. It's actually, I think, the first time that's been added. Just as a side note, the EU-Mercosur agreement has added an annex to the agreement which deepens sustainability commitment, and the EU-Indonesia agreement, this annex or this protocol specifically focuses on one commodity. The exact title of the protocol is Enhancing the Potential of the Agreement to Support Trade in Sustainable Palm Oil. And in the beginning of the protocol, it lays out some of the key elements of why both parties think that's of crucial importance. And you find some of the elements here on the slide, but it recognizes the importance of palm oil in EU-Indonesia trade. It recognizes the importance of palm oil production for smallholders, for companies in Indonesia. Obviously also recognizes that there are significant environmental and social risks related to the production of palm oil plantations and so on, and a recognition that following other debates that there's a need to promote more sustainable ways of production of palm oil. So that's setting the scene of starting the protocol with focusing on some of these key challenges and maybe also opportunities. The protocol is very much focused on recognizing this and starting from this recognizing, building a set of initiatives for cooperation, for dialogue, for capacity building to enhance this more sustainable production. As such, there are no, let's say, very strict new binding sustainability commitments in the protocol, but there's a commitment to engage to formulate these in the future. So from that perspective, it's an important initiative which will trigger a process, and it will, of course, depend on the parties involved and possibly also the stakeholders involved in the process to further operationalize these commitments and engage on these debates. And in that way, you have to read this protocol as some kind of a framework structured, which try to identify some of the key issues which might be relevant and which then can be further followed up. The protocol has 6 main articles. I'm not going to go too deep in all of them, but just to highlight the article 1 is really trying to highlight the key objectives. And as I said, that's really about promoting sustainable palm oil production and trade. And it contains some of the ideas on how that might take shape. It will ensure compliance with social, environmental, other regulations which are of importance. And then most importantly, also which is further developed in some of the next chapters, it really tries to strengthen cooperation and dialogue. And in that sense, already tries to identify a focus on which this cooperation and dialogue might focus and take shape. And I think it's important to see there a bit what's highlighted in the proposal and maybe also what's a bit downplayed. And I will have a very brief comparison to what's happening within the Indonesia FTA, because there's also a specific focus on palm oil, but there they take a bit of a different approach. And I think it's important to maybe very briefly compare them. The second article focuses specifically on the importance of sustainability insurance. That speaks directly to the issue of sustainable production. And in this context, the protocol highlights the Indonesian Sustainable Palm Oil Certification Standard as one of the mechanisms to ensure certification. I will delve a bit deeper into that in a minute. There are elements related to traceability and transparency, and an important element which basically recognizes that if we engage in more sustainable production, that will come at a cost, and that will require support for smallholders, for SMEs, to make more sustainable production possible. The other 3 articles build a bit, other 4 articles build a bit on that and try to make it a bit more concrete. There are Article 3 focuses on facilitating compliance with some of the requirements. Article 4 on transparency, and that's really, I think, an important article for the stakeholders involved, because it makes an obligation that the parties communicate transparently and openly and in sufficient detail to the stakeholders involved on the commitments, on the implementation, and so on. Then there's Article 5, which tries to further elaborate a bit on the bilateral cooperation mechanisms, and not only on the mechanisms, but some of the issues they might want to focus on with regard to sustainable palm oil production. And in that respect, and we might come back to that in the discussion, there's an interesting mentioning of the due diligence requirements, which are put out by the European Union in separate regulations and directives, and which actually directly also affect palm oil production. And then Article 6 basically formulates a commitment via the institutional arrangements to regularly review what's happening in the context of the protocol. In this context, it highlights the importance of the domestic advisory groups, the DAGs. We'll come back to that in a minute, but that's one of the mechanisms through which stakeholders can engage in the follow-up of the implementation of the agreement, and there is a continuous dialogue to see which concrete measures are proposed in the context of the protocol, and what then the follow-up will be. The basic governance model behind the protocol is, as I said, a structured EU-Indonesia dialogue mechanism, and I will come back to the different levels of dialogue, or the different institutional levels to which this dialogue can be organized in a few minutes. And it stipulates on what these dialogues can focus, very importantly, on regulatory alignment and technical standards for sustainable production on the one hand, and on the other hand, an important emphasis on capacity building, making sure producers can comply, having that happen through knowledge sharing, and also make sure that there are sufficient credible traceability systems for palm oil. So that's a bit of I think, the broad framing of this protocol and what it aims to do. Maybe to highlight some of the weaknesses, if you read it plainly, what's on paper currently for the protocol is, first, as such, there are no enforceable sustainability requirements in there at the moment. No specific commitments to what should happen. So it has a lot of soft language: strive, promote, may, as we find in many of the agreements, and there might be discussion on what the potential or the effectiveness is of this soft language. For the moment, there is no conditionality for tariff preferences for sustainably produced palm oil compared to non-sustainably produced palm oil, and I will say something about that in a second, because there it differs quite a bit from the approach which is taken in the EFTA Indonesia FTA. And so there's a risk that there might be some trade benefits, but without real sustainability progress, in the sense that if there are no very specific sustainability commitments, the agreement will mostly be about liberalizing and facilitating trade, but little direct sustainability impact. That's of course wait and see, but that's an important element. And we can come back in the discussion if you wish to some of the commitments made in terms of trade liberalization and tariffs on palm oil. So that's how it's currently approached. As I said, I want to briefly compare it to what's happening in the after Indonesia agreement, because there they take a very different approach in the sense that in the after Indonesia agreement, for the first time, they introduced this idea to have lower tariffs for sustainably produced palm oil. And in the context of that agreement, it leaves it to the countries within EFTA, so Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, to operationalize what that might mean. But in the case of Switzerland, that means that sustainably produced palm oil refers to palm oil which is certified by a number of systems which are recognized through the Swiss system. So here you have, I think, a more direct sustainability commitment in the sense that if you have certification, your palm oil will have lower tariffs compared to other palm oil produced there. So here you have the very first, let's say, application of tariff differentials to identical products, but based on how they were made, and that actually then translates into different tariffs. In the EU-Indonesia agreement, you don't have that for the moment. There is some language in the protocol which leaves the door open to start thinking or operationalizing that in the future. And that's a very, I think, important development to keep track of. On another sideline, in the annex to the EU-Mercosur agreement, which I just mentioned, there's a similar language which refers to tariff differences for sustainable products compared to non-sustainable products. What that concretely will mean, let's wait and see how that will be operationalized in relation to which products. That's still open, but the interesting development here is that you have an opening to use different tariffs for certified products compared to non-certified products. So I think that's an important thing to focus on. Within the context of the EU-Indonesia CEPA, this might mean that I think quite a bit of emphasis will come on the Indonesian sustained palm oil standard. So the national standard they developed to promote more sustainable production. Why do I focus on the ISPOS? Because it's mentioned quite a few times in the protocol. So as you all might know, there are several other certification systems which try to promote the sustainable production of palm oil, which are not mentioned. They are as a group mentioned, but the ISPO is singled out as the, let's say, assurance scheme on which collaboration, dialogue, and so on might further focus. And I think that's an important element also to keep an eye on in the near future on what that might mean in terms of strengthening ISPO, aligning it more with EU requirements, explore potential future EU recognition of ISPO in the context of the trade agreement and how that recognition might take shape. Just to highlight, in comparison again to the EFTA FTA, ISPO is there not identified as one of the systems which can certify sustainable production. Of course, ISPO as a national standard has an important reach, of course, within Indonesia. I think with regard to the ISPO, there might be some interesting debates to be held, and especially to see what the developments will be. If you look at the academic literature, and we highlight a few of the papers in the report, I think there's generally quite a bit of criticism on the strength of the ISPO system from a sustainability perspective. in the sense that it might be on some sustainability dimensions a bit less stringent than some of them, the private schemes. But that's something to be followed. I think also it's important to understand that all these standard systems are continuously evolving. They are revised at several times. And so I think if you look at some of the recent reforms of ISPO, they might have strengthened their system as an insurance system over time, and actually that might create some opportunities there. So to end off with the protocol, I think it's an interesting new development, but there's still a lot in the air about what it will actually mean, especially with regard to palm oil production in the future. There's a lot of, let's say, commitments on developing future cooperation activities, developing joint initiatives, having mechanisms to follow up on commitments and so on. But these are not yet concretely developed on what that might mean. And I think also, as with quite a few of these other consultation and mutual dialogue mechanisms, it will depend also on funding, concrete action, measurable outcomes, monitoring systems, and these types of things, and how that might take shape. If it results into concrete planning with very concrete commitments which are reviewed over time, then the protocol might constitute a framework which might be very interesting to follow in the future. And it might offer, I think, some benefits. What I do think is interesting about the framework is, even if it's still very open-ended, that if the commitments become very concrete, it does offer a series of mechanisms to follow up on that, and that might actually entail in some significant change. As such as it's now, it gives the parties quite some flexibility and openness to further develop that, and it will depend a bit on how and what will happen in that respect. That brings us to the very, and I will be brief on this, the very final point James and me looked at quite in depth is the engagement mechanisms which are in the agreement. And they actually spread out over a few parts of the agreement, which they have some provisions in the trade and sustainable development chapter, traditionally focusing on some institutional mechanisms like the domestic advisory groups. They have some mentioning in chapter 16 and 17, which James already mentioned. And there is a specific chapter 24 on institutional provisions. And these elements are very important because they will determine the implementation of the agreement and of the commitments. And they will determine the more specific focus, what some of these commitments might be. That can go in the direction of tariff differentials for palm oil products or even other products. That might go in terms of very concrete commitments in terms of capacity building and these types of things. So that's where in these institutional mechanisms where these types of decisions need to be made and need to be followed up. Some of these mechanisms will be, let's say, party to party, state to state. Others will open up opportunities for stakeholder engagement. Under the transparency provisions, all the mechanisms need to be sufficiently transparent, and provision of information is required to the stakeholders. So there's a follow-up, but there might be some mechanisms where you have very direct engagement. Very briefly, which other institutional mechanisms included in the agreement? You have the Trade Committee on the highest level, which have in all agreements. In the case of the EU-Indonesia FTA, you have 3 specialized committees. And one of them is a Trade and Sustainable Growth Committee. So that's the party-to-party committee where all the issues on the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter and all the Trade and Sustainable Development provisions, including the protocol, it will be discussed. And then underneath that, you have a number of supporting mechanisms. The domestic advisory groups and the civil society fora, they are identical to what we have in many other agreements. What's relatively new, I think, in this agreement is this idea of setting up working groups. And working groups are state-to-state groups which will be developed on specific topics to further detail some of the commitments which need to be made in the context of the agreement. And these working groups, the idea behind it, it's not yet very elaborate in the agreement. The idea is that they focus on very specific issues and they try to come up with technical proposals, concrete suggestions, and so on. And for the moment, there's one working group, I think, envisaged around motor vehicles. So that's also what we discussed so far. But if we think about what we just discussed on sustainable palm oil production, forest-related products, and so on, of course, it might be an idea or it might be an opportunity, a potential to think of working groups there, which would then focus specifically on trying to make more precise the commitments which are in the protocol. And then maybe to end off with, but some of you might already know that, a real, I think, body which is there for stakeholders to engage are the domestic advisory groups, which are formed in the context of every trade agreement and which provide an opportunity for stakeholders to engage in some of the debates. I think there's been quite some scholarly attention already to these domestic advisory groups. I think there's also a bit of criticism on how they operate, how effective they are, and so on. And we can discuss that further. But I think that's the main mechanism where some of the discussions can take place. And I think specifically when it comes to making the protocol more concrete, more actionable, that might be one of the bodies where there might be an opportunity to engage. So that's it from my side. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thanks so much, James and Axel. I think the presentation was very insightful, and we can clearly see potential risk, such as increased production of palm oil, increased trade flows of minerals, and potentially reduced space for Indonesia to develop its own industry, but also some cooperation opportunities. And one of them is the protocol on sustainable palm oil, which is also attracting a lot of attention from participants. You're looking at the Q&A session. So because we have 15 minutes left, I suggest that we go straight to the questions that have been posted in the chat. And so, yeah, either James or Axel, if you want to answer these questions, yeah, have a go.
There were a lot on the palm oil. And I think there are a few questions on, for instance, what form of support will be given to smallholders and so on. These are typically issues which now need to be further developed. So for the moment in the protocol, there's a commitment to offer support or to recognize that support is needed, but how that will take place, who will offer what type of support, that's not yet clear. So that's, I think, an important element to continue and to follow up. but it's obvious, I think, that will become an important issue, especially when I think when they start thinking about making adherence to assurance schemes a very important element of the follow-up. And then what would that mean? What does it mean for smallholders to be in compliance with ISPO, but possibly also other schemes? What would it cost? How should that be supported? And so on. So I think that's an important element to be considered there. There's a question on the relationship with the EUDR, which I think is a very interesting question as well. I think for the moment, they will operate in parallel. The commitments in the protocol are definitely not stronger than the requirements put out by the deforestation regulation. So that's, I think, should I say, I don't think there will be a difference, I mean, in terms of commitments or obligations under both. There's a clear obligation which needs to happen under the EUDR, and the obligations which will need to happen under the protocol still need to be precisely defined. So I think that's an important element. There's a question, I think, here in the question on why or the reasons why the EU-Indonesia FTA does not follow the EFTA-Indonesia approach with tariff differentials for sustainably produced palm oil compared to non-sustainably produced palm oil. And that's a very interesting question, and I think there are a few elements here to highlight. Maybe first of all, one point to highlight here is that the application of different tariffs for identical products has for a long time been very controversial. From the perspective that WTO law does not allow to discriminate between like products, also not based on the way they are produced. What's happening in the EFTA-Indonesia agreement is, I think, some kind of policy experiment to see what the reaction would be if you start applying different tariffs to identical products and whether that can work. Given this legal uncertainty on whether that type of approach can be applied or not, I think from the EU perspective, they were a bit cautious on applying this already. And that's why I think they opened it up in the protocol by referring that it might be potentially be used or further operationalized once the agreement is being implemented. So we now will have to see what will happen in the next steps on whether that type of tariff differential application will also be used. And I think it's a very interesting point to follow. A second issue related to it is, I think there might be, but of course I don't have any insights on the negotiation process in that respect, but there might also be some concerns that once you start applying tariff differentials for palm oil, which systems will you use to identify certified products? As I mentioned, the EFTA-Indonesia CEPA does not refer to ISPO as an insurance scheme, which can be used to identify sustainably produced palm oil. And that might have been quite sensitive from the Indonesian side, And that's why they might actually have opted to a different wording in the protocol, specifically referring to ISPO and also specifically referring to the aim of working with that system to strengthen it in terms of producing a palm oil more sustainably. So I think that's some of the elements which I think are important there to take into consideration why one approach is chosen and not another. Just to highlight that for the moment, it's not in the EU-Indonesia CEPA, but as I mentioned a few times, in the future, it might be one of the options. Maybe, James, there are already some other questions or you want to have a look at?
Yeah, I think I've just asked for a clarification on one of them, but yeah, I mean, I think just sort of taking a step back and looking overall, I suppose, I would say there are these kind of threats that we've identified through opening market access that look quite specific and where we have very specific commitments that have been made. And I think, Axel, as you've demonstrated, a lot of the kind of sustainability commitments have potential, but are very open-ended and cooperative and will depend on that implementation process. And so at this stage, I think it is a shame that we don't have more detail about what that cooperative process will look like. So more details around the funding that we put to it, more detail on the kind of way it will be implemented to give people confidence about that sustainability, those sustainability issues being taken seriously. Because we know from previous experience of all kinds of international agreements on all kinds of fora that cooperative provisions can be implemented with seriousness and rigor, but also can become little more than obligations on paper that don't lead to much significant happening in practice. And so, I think some kind of indication of the seriousness with which these provisions are going to be pursued, the funding that's going to be put to them, and the kind of issues that might be prioritized within the kind of big policy space that there is there for work on a range of different issues, would be helpful in us really being able to understand how seriously these issues are going to be taken. And I don't see any reason why more specificity couldn't now be given on some of those issues at a time when they're going through their final kind of processes of revision and going through the EU's institutional processes.
Thank you, James. Maybe jump in on one of the questions in the Q&A, again, relating to this tariffs linked to sustainability conditionality. And there's a question how it might play out with respect to labor standards. And it's an important question because the question relates to the fact to what would you recognize or which systems would you recognize as systems which assure sustainable production? And that then, of course, relates to the question about what do we understand under sustainable production? Which elements are very important to understand or to take into account to ensure that palm oil is produced sustainably? And there, the question will be, of course, which elements you will take into account to recognize this system. Then, of course, one of the elements can be labor standards or labor rights, which are in several certification systems recognized. But it can also then, of course, mean that you might need to have more precise criteria to make that assessment. Just as a side note there, some of you online might remember the Renewable Energy Directive of the EU, which also use assurance schemes to identify sustainably produced biofuels. And there, the European Commission set up a recognition system to identify which certification schemes could be considered as being proof of compliance with more sustainable produced biofuels. And a report by the Court of Auditors then mentioned that that recognition system to a degree worked, but was lacking a specific focus on the social dimension of sustainability, and that social dimension then, of course, relates to the integration of labor rights and labor standards in these schemes. Just to highlight, it's an important issue on an important focus on how you will set up a recognition system for assurance or certification schemes when you start working with them in the context of the trade agreement. I think now I need to hand over to you, Perrine, because we are running a bit out of time. So I'm handing over to you.
Yes, thanks, Axel, and thanks, James. I think there are one new question, but we will answer the question bilaterally. I would like to thank all participants for joining, and James and Axel for the great analysis. It was very interesting, and it's an ongoing discussion to discuss these linkages between certification and free trade agreements. I think we will stay in touch. I would like to invite the participants who are interested in following up on the implementation of this protocol to get in touch with me bilaterally so that we can collectively challenge and ask questions to the Commission to make sure it is properly implemented with adequate resources and funding. So if some of you want to engage further in the process, then please get in touch. Thanks a lot and have a great day.